Thank you for being with us today, Elaine. I've been looking forward to this. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Fred.
Awesome. Just to get us started, tell us a bit about yourself and the role that you play at RB.
Sure, yeah. Very happy to be here today. So my name is Elaine Rodrigo, and I'm Chief Insights and Analytics Officer at RB, Reckitt Benckiser, which means I'm responsible for the entire function across the group, across all the business units. So everybody who works in the consumer insights area, but also in data and analytics.
All right. Most mature organizations understand how to leverage analytics for knowledge discovery, whereas few are able to consistently aim this discovery in the right direction, which results in impressive analytics that may be functionally useless. What strategic steps would you recommend when designing analytics processes that would help avoid the use of analytics for analytics' sake?
Mm. Okay, no, I think it's a great question, and maybe I'll tell you a little bit about my background, which also kind of almost defines, I guess, where I start. And I'd say that my starting point is never the analytics. So I always start from a business question. What's the insight that you need to drive or answer that business question, and then the analytics that is required in order to inform it. But really, if I look at, I guess, the way that I've developed my career and learning over the years as well, is I started off in a very analytical space. So I started off as a PhD student and constructing a structural equation model. So really deep into building an analytical model. And then after that, I actually started my career when I left university, and I went into a market research agency. So this is like in the 1990s now, right? And that's when it was about consumer insights. It's all about insights into consumer and needs and what's going on there. So I shifted gears to thinking about that. And then actually I joined RB the first time around 20 years ago in a client role. And that's when you realize when you come in an organization that the whole point of the insight is to drive business, decisions. So therefore I kind of came around into that. And then finally, over time as analytics, I guess, became more important even in large organizations around what we call driving fact-based thinking, data-driven thinking. It's come around. So I feel like I've kind of gone round circle. And that's why now I take everything from a lens of believing that we need to know and have everything that we know, I guess, insights, data about our consumers, everything, analytical tools in one place, right? Seamlessly connected to answer business questions. So therefore, then coming back to the point, the question you asked, which is, how do you make sure, I guess I would summarize it by saying, how do we make sure we don't have impressive tools chasing problems to solve? This is the point. And in any organization, even when we as an organization come up with innovation or ideas, you don't want to come up with an innovation that doesn't actually have a consumer job to be done, right? So it's the same philosophy. So let's talk about the strategic steps. I would say the first thing is always start with the business priorities and what are the business questions out there. So what are the use cases? Start from there. And then from there, you can understand, okay, what kind of analytical tools do we require to solve that question? And within there, and maybe we'll get to that, I guess, as we keep talking, there are different levels as well of what level of analytical tools you need to solve that question. And sometimes it's like, you're trying to develop a Ferrari to solve the problem that bicycle would do. So, and then that sometimes gets in the way of itself. So I think this is the thing, for those of us, and as I said, I came from that world to start off with as well. Sometimes we fall in love a little bit with the tool. It's just like in business, sometimes we fall in love with idea and we forget what the job to be done is. So point is, always start with the business question, always start with that, that use case, and then develop the tool to solve that business question. And you don't have to start with, platinum standard at day one. Start with an MVP, a minimum viable product, get some small wins, test and learn, and then see how you scale.
I'm curious to know, you talked about how you started working in consumer insights, I think 20 years ago. What are your thoughts on how the industry has changed over the last few years? And what do you anticipate being the next trend in consumer insights within the next, let's say, 3 years?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's, as you know, every single industry has gone through a huge disruption over the last few years. So let's just talk about the insights, market research of the insights industry. Obviously, over the years, every 3 to 5 years, there's usually some kind of pivot, I'd say, or some change, right? I think about at the beginning, it was called market research when I joined this industry. If you think about it, just even what it was about researching the market. It was called consumer research. That was what it was about. Then the next stage was how to get insight from that. It's not just, it's not just data, it's insight. Okay, then it was insight to action. Then it was insight to action to business results, right? Then it was strategic thinking, etc. So every 2 to 3 years, there's something, and then it's about creativity, then it's about strategy. But really over the last 5 years, obviously, like we know, it's been about how this huge shift in the world, about how people have changed and how data and digital has really come in and is kind of in every part of our life, that created a huge disruption in this industry. I would say probably around 4 to 5 years ago is when it really hit. And the biggest change at that time was, obviously, if you look at it, the market research of the insights industry was much more survey based, right? Qualitative focus groups, so on. And you know what? I believe there is still space for that. Now, we've all learned how to do things maybe in a much more agile, kind of on-time way, but there is still a space for that. But the whole area of data, here is a new thing of thinking of how do you get insight from that? So that area has really kind of come in. And I think then what happened is you ended up with like two camps. You ended up with this consumer insight or like CMI camp. And then you had this other camp, which was like data analytical to, analytics, digital, tech-driven companies and tools that were almost like challenging what was then started to be sort of almost classified as traditional or old-fashioned. And I don't believe so. I believe you need all of it. I believe you need both sides to it, right? So I believe that where we are now is 3 years ago, I saw those two happening in parallel. I saw a lot of challenge coming from the tech and analytical world on the kind of classical CMI or consumer insights world, and creating a little bit of a disturbance there. Some of it, the disruption was good. Some of it was not good. But now I start to see it coming more together. So that's point number one. Where is it going to go into the future? It's going to keep going that way. I think the next point, the next step, and this is why I've redesigned the function of in RB. Firstly, I've renamed it. So it used to be called CMI. It used to be called Consumer and Market Intelligence, CMI. And then there was another part of the business. There was another team called DNA, Data and Analytics. And they were two parallel groups, right? And I've renamed this function Insights and Analytics because I believe that we need both to solve business questions, and brought it all together. So I'm trying to set us up. The other thing is different parts of the organization. You have to have different parts of the organization focused to solve different business questions. So they need to drive those agendas. But my team is set up to work across. So we are horizontal. I believe that the future is a world where data and insights has to be much more seamless, right? So you need to understand across the entire consumer journey. So not just upper funnel, lower funnel, whatever, but the entire journey. Start piecing together, connecting the dots much more, leveraging data, redefining perhaps what is the future of brand equity? What is the future of the consumer value equation? Some of these things are going to change. So I think it is all very exciting. And I think that the changes that I've seen in this industry, make me feel comforted over the last couple of years that the industry has woken up. I think there was a period where the industry was a little bit like, honestly, like deer in headlights, caught by what was going on. But now I feel like I see I see people and I see the big companies, agencies really starting to embrace this area and understanding how data, tech, analytics, etc., is going to take us actually to the next level of understanding people. And understanding consumers better, right? Understanding consumers as people better, and really at the end of the day. So that's all. I think that's all very exciting for our industry.
Has there been any disruptions that have been brought about by the pandemic that affected, the entire world last year? And if so, how have you guys responded to that challenge?
I think there are two things. One of them is, I guess, as a functional leader. So this is when I put on my insights and analytics hat from an industry and a capability standpoint. And then the other side is from a business lens. Maybe I'll talk from a business lens, obviously, at Reckitt Benckiser, we have brands like Lysol and Dettol in our portfolio of brands. So having brands like that, you are at the heart of everything that's going on with the COVID situation. Especially, we also have a very big business in China. So actually starting from January of 2020, we were already starting to see signals and signs of what might be to come. So Obviously, there's been a lot going on there, but I think so my team as well playing a key role in terms of keeping a little bit ahead, I guess, of what's going on in each of these markets and seeing how it's unfolded. Obviously, I wouldn't say it was just disruptive for everybody in the world, but it created a lot of change, obviously, within the organization was also going through its own transformation last year and own organizational changes. So the two kind of came together. But I think as my CEO summarized in his kind of New Year's sort of address to all of us, is that he's proud. He felt that, it was a tremendous year where honestly, you're going through huge internal change. There's all this coming from outside, but that true spirit, I think the RB spirit and the DNA of people, where people just kind of just get stuff done and just get down to it. And, at the end of the day, I think we managed to get through a year where we were still able to deliver growth. But at the same time, we were also able to invest in capabilities that will continue to set us up for the future. Therefore, then I come to what was the disruption or the change within my group. And I like to think of it as, it's almost like, what is the silver lining, right? That came out of it. And I spoke in another podcast as well. And I used this particular example so I'm half Chinese. And in Chinese, the word for crisis in Chinese is weiqi, where one word means threat or risk or danger, and the other word means opportunity. And essentially, it means in any crisis, there is obviously always a threat, but there is always an opportunity as well. And in this case, the opportunity that came up is as everybody shifted to a virtual world, all the things that I wanted to disrupt or change within my group about people going much more online, being used to working like this, speaking to consumers like this, about using digital data, using social listening, using much more agile tech with all of that kind of, the situation supercharged what I wanted to do anyway. And now it's very natural for everyone. So that's a good thing, and we need to keep doing it. The other thing that COVID created is that RB is a very dynamic company, very fast-paced to start off with. But some of our tools, our forecasting tools, for example, in the past, we used to do forecasts once a year for our 3-year plan. So you forecast for 3 years, right? But all of a sudden, with COVID, you had to forecast like every month, every week, every day, sometimes every hour. So we actually had to step change our tools to make them much more dynamic, much more granular. This is also a good thing. I mean, it was kind of done under a little bit like duress. We had to do it quickly, right? But at the same time, now it's something where I'm like, why would we want to go back to the old way anyway? We want to keep doing it this way now. So I think that agility, that speed, that dynamism, that moving to embracing data and tech were things that kind of came out of the disruption, but we want to keep that as a team going forward.
Businesses are increasingly relying on data to create value and make well-informed strategic decisions. For companies that have relatively insufficient data, what practical recommendations do you have for how they can still benefit from implementing data analytics processes?
Sure. So I'm originally from Asia. So I've actually spent most of my career working a lot on developing markets where actually you don't have a lot of data, or if you have, you kind of wonder if it's right. Yeah. So I understand the situation. What I'd say, I think there are two things. Number one is I used to say philosophy. So number one is let's start with the business question first. So you start with, rather than worrying about the data, you see, the thing is because of the nature of our job and who we are, as I said, if you are a kind of classical analytics person, we tend to start with the data and how do we build it into the tool. But first, start with the question. So what's it? And then I did this exercise once, and I really learned. I was very surprised because I had the same question where we wrote the business question, and I thought, I don't think we have the data for this. What we did was we just listed everything that we do have, and we surprised ourselves. We surprised ourselves actually with how much we had. So that's the first step. You might think you have insufficient data, but why don't you put it down on a page, write down. Then obviously, if you are a true blue analytics person, you'll be questioning every single source and saying, this isn't really 99%, whatever it is. That's okay. If it makes you feel better, give it a rating. Give it a rating on a scale of 1 to 10 of how robust you think it is, And it doesn't matter if it's all 10. And then then after that, based on whatever you have, you'll surprise yourself, as I said, that you will somehow be able to connect the dots to answer that question. Even if it's not granular or deep enough or whatever it is to build a full out algorithmic model, but you'll be able to do something with it, even if it's like just writing it on a page and drawing up something to actually get insight to answer your business question. So I think and then once you start from there, you also know what you don't have. And then the next thing is, in most companies, the problem is that the data is all over the place. So it's in other places. So once you know what you have, then you know what else you need. Then you can just go gather what you need. Then I would go to other parts of the organization to see if I can find it. And if not, then you see whether you might need to go outside to purchase it or whatever. But whatever it is, it'll be significantly less than where you started. And whatever it is, you would have already moved on something. You would have delivered some kind of value already to your organization, right? Rather than still being in the space of thinking, I don't know if I can do this because the data isn't good enough.
All right. There are several use cases and examples of where organizations failed because they over-refined their data analytics processes to a point where they failed to achieve any meaningful business values. From your experience, what are some of the potential risks that can doom the success of effective data analytics, and how can those be prevented?
So I've spoken a lot about the business questions, so I'll park that for because I think that's part of it. Let's start with the next thing, which is, in order for these analytical tools and processes to be useful, the change actually happens through people. So maybe it's old-fashioned to me, but I believe that actually it's people that drive change versus just the technology and the processes. So those things exist to enable and empower people, right? So if you want people to use these things, so it needs to, these tools need to be developed for people. And I think sometimes we forget that. So the whole idea of a user experience and thinking about now the end user who's going to use this for that business question makes a difference. And I noticed that I have in the past had a number of really brilliant analytical people who work for me who develop tools where it's like you need a PhD in analytics to use it. And the thing is, sometimes I say, just use me or a naive audience, like people who were numeric. Yeah, we know our stuff, but I'm not a builder, right? And it needs to be intuitive. So I usually tell actually my team, I said, if you want an idea, you should use things like social media, look at things like whether it's Facebook or Google or YouTube or Pinterest or TikTok, all the design to make it so easy that people don't actually need a training to use your tool. This is a starting point. To a point, in one of my previous, actually when I was in my previous company in Danone, my head of analytics had this brilliant idea. She actually hired somebody who was an expert in user design, in the analytics team. And actually that person was not visually challenged, but she basically couldn't hear that well. And because of that reason, she had this highly attuned visual skills where it was really about what you see. And she was so into the user experience. It was really interesting for us. So I think that's what I would say is one of the things. Design your tools for your users. So after you design it for your business questions, design it for your users.
Strategy execution requires that appropriate metrics are in place to measure performance and progress towards strategic goals. What are some of the key metrics that you'd recommend to ensure the successful creation and execution of a corporate strategy?
Yeah. So firstly, I don't really believe in a corporate strategy. So, there needs to be strategy, and I know what you mean. We write them as well. But, all strategy has to land in markets and be executed. Otherwise, there was no point in having it in the first place. So I believe that, so I work a lot on strategic plans, etc., but we make sure that the insight and the data is from the ground up so that it is actually reflective of a true situation. So that's one thing. So therefore, this question is really broad, and I think it depends also on what are the strategic priorities and goals of your organization at the point in time. But if I talk about RB, for example, at the moment, okay? So when I look at the strategy, what are some of the KPIs that we use? Obviously, we're a very performance-driven organization. So obviously we look at the usual ones like revenue and, and profit and margin, and set. But generally, if I look at it, number one, myself, I look to see whether something is consumer centric. So once again, is this solving any kind of consumer problem? Is this really, is this a job to be done, for example? So that's more a qualitative kind of assessment, okay? Is it really consumer centric? But then usual kind of metrics would be things like, in some cases, it depends on what you're trying to drive for that category or brand, but it could be about driving penetration, for example, could be one metric. Market share is an obvious one, so we look at that. But we also talk about new places, new spaces. So we're trying to drive growth here. So are there new channels that you could go for? Are you trying to capture new occasions? Are you trying to capture new target markets, new audiences? Are you trying to capture more points of distribution? So there are many, many different KPIs. I think the key thing is number one is to go back to, strategy is usually designed to find growth, right? And where is it you're going to find those growth? And then, don't have too many metrics as well. Have just like, 3 or 4. And then as you say, you need to track them regularly in market.
When you talk about tracking the metrics and KPIs regularly, what's the ideal time frame for revisiting those metrics to make sure that you're still on target? Is there some that you've used in the past to go back to and see, okay, it's been this amount of time that has elapsed. Let me see how we, trending as far as this metric. Is there anything that you as far as
usually most of the time the metric itself doesn't change all the time. But sometimes the source of the data might shift a little bit depending, right? It depends on what it is. But like let's talk about e-commerce then. At the moment, that's an area that's shifting all the time. So what are the metrics for e-commerce? The metrics is about how do we measure it? How do we measure what's the source of data that we use, right? Obviously in channels which are more, the Amazons and so on the world, it's a little bit more stable, but D2C, direct to consumer in the open marketplace, how do you track market share of that, for example? When you don't know what the full universe is, and the universe is changing even as you and I are speaking right now. So in those things, you need to be a little bit more flexible. You need to be a little bit more agile in terms of the source of data. So for our e-commerce area, we have pretty much real-time data that keeps coming in as well. So the metrics do not change day to day, but we do have to keep an eye on the source of the data.
When hiring for your teams, for those candidates that interview with you, do you tend to get creative with your interviewing questions?
So firstly, I try, I don't like going to interview, like trying to trick people or call them out or whatever. So for me, firstly, an interview is a conversation. So I prefer it to be a dialogue and a conversation of getting to know each other better. So for me to get to know the person, and that for that person to also get to know our company. So it kind of works both ways, right? As well. So, but what I try to do is to make sure, I do try to understand whether, I guess, to try to use concrete examples rather than just asking people what they've done, to see how some of the competencies that I require are actually flowing through. And usually, I suppose that at my level now, honestly, I am checking less for technical competencies and details, right? But at this stage, it's usually around leadership. So it's a bit of experience, yes, but then leadership around how do you do those things that we've been talking about? How are you able to firstly engage with stakeholders around understanding what the business priorities are? How are you then able to understand who your users are? How are you able to start from something small and scale it up, right? So examples of that, examples of managing difficult stakeholders. How do you actually, so those are some of the things that I look at, but I do also sometimes ask people questions like, what do you want to do 3 to 5 years from now? Not trying to catch anybody out, but for me, it's important because when they're joining the organization, I don't think of them just for this job, this one job. I want them to think about what they want to do next. And it's interesting, as I said, most of the time, the people I hire, honestly, my reports are all 20 plus years of experience. Occasionally, I will speak to, people who are below them. And in that millennial population, it's interesting how often I get the answer, like, I haven't actually really thought about that. So there are two answers. Either I haven't really thought about that, or the other side, which is that they're spending too much time thinking about it, but actually not kind of landing on anything. So sometimes I do ask that question as well. And it's interesting, one or two situations, I think it's like the interview sort of almost turned into a coaching, almost like a career coaching session for the individual, because that person like, I can't believe I've never thought about this. And maybe that's why I haven't made as much progress in my career. And I'm like, so nothing wrong with that. No need to beat yourself up over it. Now you know about it. Why don't you go take some time and think about it, and let's reconnect when you have thought about it.
Last question, and this is one of my favorite questions because I get a different variety of responses from different leaders. What has helped you get to where you are, and what word of advice would you give to someone that wants to pursue a career that's similar to yours?
Yeah, it's an interesting. So, um, a lot of people like I don't know, when they ask you questions like, "What did you always know you wanted to do? What you're doing now?" And sometimes they expect me to say no, because that's the answer that they want to hear. Because sometimes they don't really know. And in my case, actually, it's just unique because I am doing exactly what I wanted to do. Okay, I didn't think that I would be, not this company specifically, but when I was in university and I studied marketing, I knew that I wanted to do something in this knowledge sphere. So I loved research. I loved knowledge. I didn't know what's called insight back then, but I loved that piece. I wanted to do something as well, which is to do with learning and teaching people and so on. And I really wanted to do something on an international stage, like travel the world and see it. So I planned it out and I got here. But the thing is, the path is not always straight. I think this is the point, right? It's not linear. It's not a linear path. So I would say, I think for me, my key things is, firstly, I always plan whatever role I want to do throughout. So I have like a short-term plan. It's like even in business, usually you have like you have your immediate goals for the next 12 months. And then, there's strat plans, right? For 3 years. And then there's a long-term plan. So generally I have those steps in mind. So I have a further out goal. And then I think about what do I need to do in order to get there. But you need to know as well. So that's the first thing. Then I ask myself, what are my strengths? So makes me unique, and what are my strengths? And how would I leverage those? And then what are my gaps in order for me to get there? And the gaps will keep surfacing because the world is changing. So it will keep, and as you're growing, there'll always be something that you don't know at a point in time, but it's better to know it. So, and then what I do is I leverage my strengths as I go along while finding ways of actually filling the gaps in my own knowledge or my own expertise through my job or through other ways, So that's one part of it. And then the other part, which I think is really important for myself, I think for everybody, but particularly as a woman, as a female leader over the last 20 over years. I think this is a life lesson for everybody, but for myself, particularly trying to manage these, whatever you want to do, your ambition, your plan, but with your life journey. Your life takes different steps along the way, right? Whatever it is, male or female, but your life journey, your goals, your purpose. But sometimes it's not stagnant. It's not like that. It's not static at every point in time. And you just need to kind of, it's like I always knew eventually where I wanted to be. But along the way, I had to take a couple of pauses or take a little side steps because of various reasons. Like for example, when I started having kids, I was in the UK, but it wasn't kind of working out. Honestly, I'd be in this position so much faster if I'd stayed here. But I made a decision not to. I made a decision to move back to Asia because I could continue a career with support. It's not this kind of career path, steep like this, but I could still have a career. But then I decided since I couldn't go steep, I was going to go wide. So I started using that opportunity to actually gather more sort of breadth. You talk about your T, right? More skills and competencies and so on. So once they were grown up, I was ready to push again. I was ready for it. Yep. So yeah, know your, kind of, I guess, know where you want to be, know where you want to go, know your strengths, know your gaps, and map it out, with your life journey as well, and understand that it's not. Sometimes it's about timing. Maybe now's not the right moment, but maybe another time's the right moment.
Elaine, it's been wonderful having you on. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. I'm looking forward to having a follow-up conversation in the near future.
Nice. Thank you, Fred.